focus of this lecture is the question, why do we believe what we believe? Ultimately, this is a theology class, so one of the areas of focus will be, why do we believe in God? Or what language do we use to talk about God? Um, and so this kind of introductory lecture is really going to hopefully help us kind of wrestle with those types of questions. Now, a couple terms that I want to help us understand as we move through here. One of them is called social imaginary. Now, we're going to see that in a little bit, but the term social imaginary is just a fancy way of talking about how we intuitively kind of see the world. So you watched the Jamie Smith lecture where he talked about how we as human beings, we tend to think that we're thinking things like bobbleheads, big brains on a stick, I think is the way he put it. And so we tend to think about even religious belief and faith in that way. We think if we have the right ideas about God or right ideas about the world, that will then kind of change the way we live or whatever. But what Smith was trying to get at is this notion of maybe to be human, or a proper view of humans, is that we are loving creatures. And what social imaginary is getting at is that there's a way of perceiving the world that is kind of comes before reason. It's a way of just kind of intuitively sensing that this is the way that the world is. It's like driving in your car. You get in your car at one place, you drive 30 miles, and you've done it so many times, you don't have to think about it. So you end up at the place you were driving to, and you wonder, when did I turn here, or when did I do this? I don't remember doing those things. We mainly come across social imaginary when we encounter a different culture. Our way of doing things gets challenged and rocked when we enter into a different culture that has a different way of kind of intuitively living in the world. So we want to think about beliefs in that way, that maybe faith is about concepts and is about ideas, but maybe it's more about a way of life. So I wanted to get that out right away, that when I use that term, social imaginary, that will hopefully make sense. And we'll talk about that more as we kind of move along here. So here are some questions that I, just to get you thinking. So what language do you use to talk about God? Sometimes I think we take for granted the fact that it's language that forms and kind of shapes our way of making meaning of the world. So what language do we use to talk about God? In your experience, has it become easier or more difficult to believe in God? And how do you make sense of the different religious and theological traditions? Why are there so many different ways of talking about God? We live in a particular time that I think is really wrestling with these questions. How do we make sense of God? How do we make sense of the world? How do we make sense of people from different traditions? And what does that mean about belief and faith? Now, for example, this is the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed is one of the ancient creeds of the church. And by creed, we're just kind of talking about beliefs. It's a statement of belief. And we're going to talk about this later when we get to the Council of Nicaea. But what I want you to notice, and I've bolded some of the language. So it starts out a lot like the Apostles' Creed. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, or creator of heaven and earth, sometimes it's said. Of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, begotten from the Father before all ages. God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of the same essence as the Father. The Greek word there is homoousios. Now, think about this statement, and if you would look through it, what you would see is these interesting words that we're just used to. So, calling God Father, Almighty, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, begotten. And we tend to get used to this language. But what's interesting is this language is grounded in a particular way of understanding the world, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Or on the other side here, or the bolded part, and we believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life. He proceeds from the Father and the Son. This is called the filioque clause, the procession of the Holy Spirit from the Father and the Son. You know, there are Christians who have wrestled with and fought over this one line. What does it mean to proceed? And does the Holy Spirit proceed from just the Father, or does the Spirit proceed from the Father and the Son? So this is just an example to show you how the language matters, and that the language is grounded in a particular way of being in the world. And to do theology, we got to unpack some of this. Um, Now, again, I know for some of you probably were taking this course, these are things that we just don't think about. But we are inhabiting a particular time and a particular space and particular culture. And so we talk about God in certain ways. We talk about having a relationship with God, or a relationship with Jesus Christ, or um, I'm spiritual but not religious. I mean, these types of things. These are all grounded in our own kind of cultural context. And so what is the connection between the language we use to talk about God and the world in which we live? So we'll come back to the Council of Nicaea and the Apostles' Creed. Now, I asked you to watch this video before viewing this lecture because you can't click on it. But in the kind of face-to-face class, I click on it. We watch the video together. It's an older song by a band called XTC. They're British, right? And so you listen to it. Dear God, hope you get the letter. I pray you can make it better down here. Sorry to disturb you. I feel that I should be heard loud and clear. We need a big reduction in the amount of tears. All the people who made your image fighting in the street. But then you get this whole litany of things that this guy doesn't believe over on the other side. I won't believe in heaven or hell, or saints or sinners, no devil as well, no pearly gates, no thorny crown. You're always letting us humans down. The wars you bring, the babes you drown, those lost at sea. On and on. If there's one thing I don't believe in, it's you. Now, the Nicene Creed that we just looked at and XTC's Dear God come out of two different kind of cultural contexts, or two different social imaginaries. One is grounded in a language, the Nicene Creed is grounded in a language that takes for granted that there is this other higher reality. XTC is writing at a time where belief in God is actually becoming much more difficult. I think this was written in the 80s or something like that. And so it's important for us to kind of wrestle with this song and what they're kind of talking about. And I pose some questions to you as you watch the video to be thinking about. Do you resonate with this? Some of you are probably like, no way, this is dumb. Some of you can't imagine not believing in God because you've lived with church and believing in God all of your life. Others of you maybe are like, no, I resonate with what this guy's saying. And so we want to talk about that. What makes some people more likely to agree with the singer and other people to say, no, I can't imagine a world in which God doesn't exist. Now, Pew research. So my research is in young people leaving the church. And so there's this religious research stuff that's being done by different organizations. And what they're finding is that increasingly people in the West, or people in kind of North America, the United States, are leaving religion. Particularly young people are leaving religion. So these are just some stats for you to see. You can see the decline. Evangelical Protestant has gone down, Catholic has gone down, mainline Protestant has gone down, whereas unaffiliated, the nuns, N-O-N-E-S as they call them, are increasing, and then non-Christian faith is ticking up a little bit as well. But the biggest jump is in those who don't really kind of claim any religious belief. And here's just a summary of some of it. So overall, Americans have become slightly less religious. The overall drop in religiosity has been driven by the rapid growth of the religious unaffiliated category. This one is simply saying it's generational replacement. So older people who believe in God are dying, and younger people who don't believe in God are kind of coming on. And so you're getting an increase in the number of people who no longer connect with religion. And so that may be some of you, that may not be some of you, but generally the younger population, 18 to 30 or whatever, there's an increase in the number of people who no longer identify with a particular tradition. This is simply saying that even though religion is down, spirituality is up. And this is just some stuff about how they view kind of different religious organizations and so on. But the important point here is to simply say that there's evidence to suggest that there's a change that's happening in the way that people think about religion and belief and faith and the way they think about God, that is somehow leading to less of a commitment to particular traditions by young people. They're tending to kind of move out and kind of leave Christianity and tradition goodbye, even if they still want to hold to some kind of spirituality. Now, how do we make sense of this? That's really my question. That's how I want to frame this course. What are the conditions of our belief? What makes something more believable, less believable, or whatever? Now, to get into that, I want to talk a little bit about Star Wars. So here you have Ben Kenobi. If you're familiar with Star Wars, this is from Episode 4, the very first movie that came out. This is Ben Kenobi, who is a Jedi. And one way to think about what's happening in our contemporary Western culture is we're having a shift in social imaginary, that the way of imagining the world that includes God is changing, that 500 years ago to not believe in God was almost impossible because God was at the center of everything. The church was at the center of everything. It was just a given that they would believe in God as a basis for morality and everything else. But now, because of scientific stuff, because of enlightenment, because of the Renaissance, because of all these other things, it's harder to believe in God, or the social imaginary is such that it makes believing in God much more difficult. Now, why talk about Star Wars? Well, Star Wars actually sets up kind of these two sides, because you get Ben Kenobi, who believes in the Force, believes there's something more going on in the world than meets the eye. So here's what he says. The Force is what gives a Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together. A guy named Charles Taylor, who we'll talk about here in a minute, would refer to this as a porous self. So think about a strainer, right? What does a strainer do? It lets things through. And so Ben Kenobi is a porous self who believes that the material world, the material reality in which he lives, isn't the only thing, that isn't the only reality. There's something else that is connected, that's interpenetrating, that's all around them, some power. And for him, it's the Force. Now, Han Solo, on the other hand, represents kind of our more kind of contemporary culture, in the sense of saying, look, all there is the material world. So you get this quote from Star Wars. He's talking to Luke Skywalker. Kid, I've flown from one side of this galaxy to the other. I've seen a lot of strange stuff, but I've never seen anything to make me believe there's one all-powerful force controlling everything. There's no mystical energy field that controls my destiny. Hokey religions and ancient weapons are no match for a good blaster at your side, kid. Right? Now, what we're going to see is Han Solo represents the other side. So as we talk about kind of a contemporary Western social imaginary, we have gotten so used to technology, and we have a problem, we get sick, we go to the doctor. We don't necessarily just pray. I know we do, but we don't just pray. We don't just go to our priest. We don't go to our pastor. We go to the doctor, who gives us medicine. And there's a scientific explanation for it. So Han Solo, think about the blasters, represents this idea that we can technologically manipulate the world and solve problems, and that is really the power at work in the world. There is no force. There is nothing higher, whereas Ben Kenobi believes that there's something else going on above reason, above technology, above weapons. So these are two different, radically different worldviews at work. And my argument is this: while most of you listening to this, maybe not all, most of you probably think you're a Ben Kenobi. Yet most of us in the West live our life like Han Solo. We give lip service to religion and God, but yet we put our trust in our phones that we can't seem to put down, computers, technology, so on and so forth. So this is a way of thinking about social imaginary. Um, and these are ways of seeing the world or inhabiting the world that we don't think about. They're unconscious or they're subconscious. Um, and I think you can see that when you go again to different cultures. So this is Charles Taylor. He's a Canadian philosopher. Wrote this big, thick book, 900 pages, called The Secular Age. And he's making the argument, or he's trying to make the argument about where does secularity come from? And what he argues is there's a shift of social imaginary that happened because of the Reformation. In the 1500s, a person could not believe in God, which meant God permeated everything. As I said earlier, the church was at the center of society, culture, all of it. But now we've moved to a time where God has been pushed to the periphery. And again, we put our trust in these other things. We don't necessarily see the world as being inhabited by all these different these beings or creatures or so on. Even though if I asked you, do you believe in angels, demons, so on, some of you would probably say yes. We act as though that's not necessarily true or the case. So for Taylor, he's asking the question: what causes this shift? How do we make this move? Now, to use another example, I used Star Wars, so now we'll go to The Hobbit. The world of J.R.R. Tolkien is an enchanted world. It is a world where there are forces at work in the world. Trees are not just trees. Trees can get up and walk around and talk. There's other things at work in the world. It's much more of a Ben Kenobi world. Now, it's important to understand that Tolkien was a Catholic, and that The Hobbit in The Lord of the Rings really represents a Catholic worldview, because Catholics, as we'll talk more and more, really see this kind of interpenetration of the spiritual in the material and so on and so forth. A Protestant could not have written The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. In fact, when you think about the difference between Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and in the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis being a Protestant, there's some differences there, even though they were good friends. So think about Radagast the Brown here, who sees the world as an enchanted place. So that's the world of the 1500s. That's the porous south. That's this world in which God is at the center of everything. Now the villain, I put the villain up here, I can't remember his name, but right. So Saruman and Sauron are about power and technology, and they see trees as merely fuel and so on. So the world is cut off from these things. Again, kind of two different ways of kind of thinking about the world. Now, this is an example of a cathedral, a Catholic cathedral, and what do we see? We see, hopefully you see, maybe you don't, but what I see is a much more kind of world of The Hobbit. So this worship space speaks to a particular social imaginary. Now, many of you are probably Protestants or whatever, and so maybe you've never been to a Catholic church or whatever. But it's important, I think, for us to recognize that maybe the differences between Catholic and Protestant and all the different Protestant denominations comes down to, in some way, a different way of kind of thinking about the world. That Catholics inhabit a different social imaginary than Protestants, and we'll kind of get to that. This is another example. This is one of my favorite churches. This is in Minneapolis. This is St. Mary's Basilica. An excellent church. I've been to church there many times. It's beautiful. Again, much different than the church that I go to. So here is a Christian Reformed church. This is the kind of church that I go to. Notice the walls are white. You got a screen and all these different things. This is the different social imaginary. And now, I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong, so don't hear that. It's saying it's different. And what we're going to try to wrestle with is we got to account for the difference. And here's a big megachurch. And again, we could unpack this. What does this say about the world and God and so on and so forth? So again, I hope we see, here's Charles Taylor again. I hope we understand this idea of social imaginary. Now, what does Taylor argue in his book? What he argues is there's been a shift, and that our culture has cut itself off from transcendence. And basically he says that we now see the sacred within what he calls the immanent frame. So if you think about Transcendence is this idea there's something else out there, Ben Kenobi. Immanence is the idea of this world is all we got, Han Solo. And what Taylor argues is we've now come to see kind of the sacred in the context of immanence. So think about the things that we put our trust in. Politics. Think about this last political election, how everybody's all getting this way and that way. And we almost treat it religiously on both sides, right? Money, economics, technology. These are the things that we put our trust in. And in some ways, these have become the arenas where we see things as being sacred. Now, what Taylor argues is that even though that's the case, there's still a hauntedness to the world. We sense that there's something more. We sense that there should be some mystery or something. And your generation, if you're a young person, college age, you sense that. Think about the experiences we try to have. Our contemporary society is all about trying to get experiences. So now instead of going to church to get this kind of sacred experience, what's happening is you're going to a concert. I'm writing a book on heavy metal. And one of the things I'm trying to show is how the heavy metal concert becomes this new way of engaging this kind of notion of the sacred. So we go to concerts to get these experiences. Extreme sports. I've watched a video of a guy jumping off cliffs like this. Think about the number of young people who are into kind of all of these different kind of nature things or thrill seeking, bungee jumping, whatever. It's as if we're seeking some kind of experience within this immanent world that we just sense there should be something more. Serve projects I would put on this. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not bashing serve projects. But I'm just thinking about what drives us to feel the need to have to go to these other cultures and these other places to proclaim the gospel. Now, on the one hand, yeah, it's because Jesus has told us to do it. And we're trying to be faithful. But I think there's more to it than that. I think there's a sense, a hauntedness of there's got to be something more to this world. So I hope you get the idea of social imaginary and what that means. Now, what we're going to wrestle with throughout this course is how have Christians throughout history articulated the gospel within a particular social imaginary? And where does the language for talking about God come from? And maybe the language that was used back by Augustine in the 4th century doesn't work for us anymore, or we have to translate it, or maybe it works well. We're going to read Confessions, and you can tell me whether or not you resonate with what he's saying. It certainly will need some interpretation. So one of the things we want to do is wrestle with the social imaginary in the historical and cultural context of theology, and thinking about theology as a way in which kind of people are kind of making sense of the world. So why study theology? Why do we make you take this course and so on? Well, one of the things we do is we develop a language for talking about God, or talking about faith, or even your own human experience. And what we need to do is understand, where does that language come from, and how does our cultural context shape and form that language and that way of talking about who God is. We study theology to engage other people's experiences of the world. So we're going to look at an African bishop. We're going to look at a medieval mystic. We're going to look at the African American experience, the Latino experience, Northern European experience. So there's all these different theological ways of kind of not just talking about God, but also what it means to be a human being. And so also then framing our engagement of the world. I'm a big Calvin and Hobbes fan, so you'll probably see more of those. All right. Now, that being said, what I want to do is I asked you to read Plato. And I know it was a tough read, and I gave you those couple of little videos to watch to try to give you some context. Now, the reason it's a tough read isn't because, you don't think philosophically. All of us think philosophically. You have a philosophy. Subconsciously, you have a way of making sense of the world. You have a theology. You have a way of making sense of God. Even if you claim not to believe in a God, you have some kind of thing that is the highest thing, and you articulate that in a certain way. Really, the issue is trying to understand, what is Plato talking about? And one of the things that I want you to be thinking about is the difference between, and we're going to see this through this whole course, the differences between the world of ideas, the world of the spiritual, we might say, from a Christian perspective, and the material or the creation, the embodied part. So you'll see in this line here, it says eternal, invisible, immaterial, and then temporal, sensory, material. The question for us is going to be, what is the relationship between these two? All of our theological discussion is going to focus on that. Now, what I want you to think about with Plato, so it says the divided line, a picture of Plato's ontology. Ontology is simply a fancy word that means being, what something is. And one of the things that we have to think about is which side gets privileged. Now think about Christianity. What makes you you? So my name is Jason. What makes Jason Leaf Jason Leaf? Is it my body? Is it my soul? Which one of those do we privilege? So as we think about Plato, what we're going to see is Plato and the Greeks, particularly in Plato and Aristotle, are privileging the eternal, the invisible and the immaterial, or the spiritual, or the ideas. So if I could draw on this, and I can, I should probably figure out how to do that. But so you see the world of being, the world of numbers, the world of objects, the world of images. Draw a line. I know there's lines drawn here, but so that one line that's drawn in between the world of numbers and the world of objects separates the physical from the immaterial. And what Plato is privileging is the immaterial. So if you ask what is real, if you ask Plato what is real, let's take a tree. When you look out at the trees, you see all these different trees, pine tree, oak tree, maple tree, and it's like most of the trees drop their leaves in winter, but I got a tree outside my backyard that just stays with its needles. They're different, and yet if I were to ask you what is that, you would say tree. So the issue here is two things. How do we know? But also, what is the most real part of the tree? Is it the physical tree, or is it the idea of the tree that we all get in our heads? So when I say tree, you get the idea in your head. What Plato is arguing is that the idea of treeness is the most real thing. That's what he calls the world of the universals. So we look at all of these particular trees and we say tree, 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 tree. What do they all have in common? Treeness. That, for Plato, is what he is saying is the most real. And you move from the world of being, from the forms, right? As you watch that video, the forms or the ideas, they move down into the world and give shape and form to the material world. So he would argue there is a thing called treeness that exists in the heavenly realms that gives form to the real or the material trees that we encounter. Okay, think of humans, think of dogs, think of, right, all of these different things. Again, the example that was given in that video was a sculpture, right, giving form and shape to the clay. But what this does, and this is very important, is it privileges the invisible and the immaterial. So for Plato, the material world is less real than the immaterial. And to a certain degree, it's something to be overcome. Now, you also read the allegory of the cave. And so Plato's allegory of the cave is talking about how what's happened to humanity is we've fallen. So he has his own version of the fall. We've fallen and becoming enslaved, and what we think we're seeing when we look at the material world, we think we're engaging the real world, but we're like these people who are in chains watching the shadows on the wall. And then when somebody escapes and gets out and they see the real world, and then they come down and they try to tell the rest of them, they think, you're dumb or you're whatever, right? But it's an issue of being deceived by the material or the cultural or whatever. And the purpose of life is to get up out of the cave. The purpose of life is to, through reason, come to connect with the higher reality that is the forms or the ideas. And he uses the example of the sun. So again, you did the reading, right? For Plato, the sun, the guy comes out of the cave and he sees the sun. The sun is the source of all goodness and beauty and so on. And it illuminates everything else. And so it's being freed from this cave to the sun is the purpose of life. And the way that we do that is through philosophy. That's what he would argue. Now, why waste your time talking about Plato? What I want you to sense is that there is something about Plato's philosophy that has resonance with Christianity. And what we're going to see as we look at the patristics, the early Christians, is the social imaginary that they had to work with was a Greek one. The language that they had to work with was Greek. The categories that they had were Greek categories. So when we go and we begin talking about, which we'll do in the next module, talk about Trinity and the person of Christ and homoousios and all this stuff, we have to understand that this has a context, a language that is grounded in all of this stuff. And it'll be important for us to kind of make that claim. So as we think about the human person, this is Plato's understanding of the human person. That we have a rational side, and then we have an embodied side. And there are three parts to us: the rational, the spirited, and the appetitive. Right? And so if you think of it as a chariot, the soul works best when reason is in charge. Our appetite can lead us to do unhelpful things. We need spirit to make us determined to do the right thing. So think of our embodiedness as these horses that want to just go and run and do. And reason is that which kind of guides them and holds them back and takes the rein. So it's a picture of the human person that sees reason as that which rightly orders our lives, right? Now, again, remember what Jamie Smith was talking about. In some ways, our culture still wants to think, we want to think about, thinking. And in Christianity, it's like we got to think the right way or believe the right things. Well, what we want to see is how this was also a Platonic ideal. And in order for us to understand some of this early Christian stuff that we're going to talk about, we have to understand this kind of Platonic context because it provides the social imaginary. Now, when we get to the medieval period, we're going to see there's a shift. We'll talk about Aristotle. But one of the things that's interesting about the Reformation is it's not just all of a sudden Luther has this epiphany and says, oh, the church is doing all these wrong things. I mean, that's there. But it's also a shift in social imaginary. And it's a much more radical shift in social imaginary. And so we'll spend some time kind of talking about how the Reformation becomes this shift. So I wanted you to see here, as we talk about social imaginary, how we kind of think about the world. We inherit these categories and these ways of speaking. And it's important for us to acknowledge them. We're going to try to understand our own as we go through this course. But as we begin to think about the patristic period, which is this early period of the church, we need to understand the Platonic worldview and perspective. So hopefully it was helpful for you to read it and then see those videos and then hear me kind of talk about it now here as we kind of think about Plato. So just to summarize, for Plato, epistemology is simply a fancy word for how we know anything. How do we know? Well, for Plato, it's about the forms. So for him, there's a hierarchical nature to reality. There's a higher and lower. The higher is the intelligible, the rational, reason, or soul, spirit. The lower is the sensual, the material, the body. And the forms participate, right, in the material. So think about the world of Ben Kenobi. Think about the world of Lord of the Rings. Platonic world is a similar world where the ideas participate in the material reality and give form and shape and so on. But it's also important to understand that for Plato, the ideas exist outside the human mind. There is a real thing called treeness. There is a real thing that is humanness or maleness or femaleness or all of these different things. That when we talk about it down here in our material reality, It's a shadow of the real thing that is the idea, but it participates in that idea. And that's how we can know, and that's how we can come to understand what is good and what is right, and so on and so forth. So recognizing that hierarchical way of kind of thinking about the world is really important as we think about Plato and as we begin to think about how the church develops and how theology develops and how they begin to think theologically in the early church in the patristic period. And we'll see this especially when we begin to wrestle with Augustine. So I hope this has made sense. You're going to have some time to ask questions and so on and so forth on the posts. But hopefully this has made some sense, and hopefully you understand what we mean by social imaginary. And I hope as we go through this course, we can really wrestle with, what it means to have faith, and that it's not just about believing in ideas and concepts. That faith is also about a particular way of life, and a way of being in the world, and how that kind of forms and shapes us. And we'll spend some time on that.